So I'm responsible for writing all this, and I don't believe it anymore. And you may wonder, how did that happen? Well, I started running in 1969, and at that time we didn't know what we should eat, but we presumed that we continued eating what we normally ate, which was largely more protein, perhaps not as much fat as we now eat. But there was no focus on carbohydrates. And then, unfortunately, research came out of Scandinavia suggesting that the more carbohydrate that you had in your muscles, the faster you would run and the further you could run. And of course, as soon as we read this, we thought, gee, this is amazing. So I was the first guy to start measuring glycogen in the muscles in South Africa. I measured it in myself, we measured it in everyone, and that became the focus. And we reduced all of exercise physiology to one variable, the glycogen in your muscles. The more glycogen you had, the faster you were going to run. And that became the focus. So, of course, I adapted to that diet, and I found my running got worse. But, of course, I couldn't, at the moment, I didn't realize, and I became fatter. I put on about 3 kilograms, and I could never understand. I would run 200 kilometers a week, and I couldn't budge my weight. And so my running got slower and slower. And then eventually, it got so bad that I just stopped competitive running and started jogging. And then the jogging got so bad that I was still jogging, but less and less, and finding it a real problem, and really not enjoying it, and not wanting to run. And here I wrote the book, and I didn't want to run. And then what happened was I'd finished writing the next book in the sort of saga, which is called Waterlogged. And the night I finished it, my brain said to me, you must get up tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock and you must run every day for the rest of your life. And I always listened to my brain. So I went out and ran. And I chose the flattest course. It wasn't that I wasn't running, but I said, okay, now if I'm going to start regularly every day, I want to go on a hilly course the first day, I must go on a flat course. And I struggled through. And then I got home, and fortunately I knew I was going to speak in 6 weeks in Sweden. And so then I checked my incoming emails, and there was an advert, lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks. I thought, gee, if I'm 6 kilograms light, I'm going to look really good in front of these runners in Sweden. So I said, and I looked, I thought, but I know it's impossible. You can't lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks without hunger. That was the key. And then I went and read further, and it turned out it was 3 scientists I knew very well and who I respected. So I said, but they can't be bogus. They must have something. So I went and looked for their book, which was called The New Atkins for the New You. And of course, I knew Atkins is a disaster. He killed more people than he saved. So I thought, no, this is very strange. How can these people be speaking about Atkins? So I went to the bookshop, and that was the last copy they had, and I opened it, and within half an hour I saw that there's a whole science on low carbohydrate eating, which I'd never read before. I didn't know about it. I'm a trained physiologist. I didn't know anything about it. And so then I decided, after an hour's reading, I said, that's it, I've eaten my last carbohydrate. And I adapted the ideas very quickly, and I was pretty radical. And thereafter, I went and had my blood tests and discovered that I was pre-diabetic. And so I was going to benefit dramatically from this diet. And within a short time, I found I had no hunger. My weight just dropped off. My running came back, and I started running as well as I had 20 years before. And I was just really enjoying life again. And it was amazing. So it's like you come out of this fog, and all of a sudden it's clarity, and you see everything, and you really enjoy life again. And I literally felt like I'm back to being 20, although I'm 63. Felt like I'm 20 again.
And are you angry at yourself or at the medical world? I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I couldn't be angry, but I just worry that how this could have been sustained for so long. I'm angry because I ran 7 Comrades marathons, and the reason I stopped before I'd done 10, you see, the goal is always do 10 and then you get your number. The reason I stopped is I was just starting running slower and slower and slower. It was just becoming more effort. But I now, had I been eating a high-fat diet, I would easily have done those other 3 without any problem whatsoever. I find now that I don't even train as much, and I sustain the same level of fitness. So there's something about a high-carbohydrate diet, in my view, which prevents you adapting properly, and you have to keep running to keep your fitness levels. But I mean, there have been some incredible stories since then. Bruce Fordyce, who won the Comrades 9 times, and his running also was getting slower and slower and slower, and he never stopped running. He ran the Comrades Marathon 30 consecutive years. When he went on this diet, his performance just dramatically improved. And at age 56, he can run 8 kilometers in 31 minutes at altitude, which is roughly about 5 minutes slower than when he was in his peak at 25. So he's running, and in fact he came second in the New York City Marathon for his age group, which 3 years ago, when he was eating the old diet, he couldn't have done.
And he now eats the high-fat,
He eats the high-fat, but the best example is a chap called Oscar Chalupsky, who's now 49 years old, and he's won a particular race in America between the two Hawaiian Islands. It's a kayaking race over 50 kilometers. Takes about 3.5 hours. He competes against the world's best. These are the guys who won Olympic medals. And this year, he won the race at the age of 49. He beat all these youngsters of 23, 24, 25, probably all of whom are eating high carbohydrate diets. He lost 16 kilograms going into the race, and he smashed them, and he's won it now 12 times. And they couldn't understand, how can a 49-year-old win this race?
Incredible.
Yeah.
So is it it's clearly a rejuvenating, or it's been a rejuvenating process for yourself and others.
Exactly, and I was speaking again the other night, and a guy got up, and he looked fantastic. He was a bit younger than me, probably mid-50s. And he said, Dr. Noakes, I'm one of your disciples. He said, I had exactly the same experience. I ran the comrades, I ran many marathons, and I got slower and slower and slower. And it got so bad, I had to stop running. And he said, I read about your story, I changed my diet, I lost 20 kilograms. I'm now training 80 kilometers a week, and I'm able to run as fast as I did 20 years ago. Now, what was really interesting about that was it's like he had a nutritional deficiency. And that's one question I wonder, whether progressively I wasn't developing a nutritional deficiency, which I could only correct when I started eating properly again. And that what nutrient it is missing, I don't know. But that's exactly what it looks like when you got something that's going worse and worse and worse, and then suddenly reverse it. It looks like it's a nutritional deficiency. And in fact, the first athlete I spoke to, the first athlete who experienced that was a guy called Jackie Meckler, who won the Comrades Marathon 5 times in the 1960s. And he said in the 1950s, his running got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And he became anemic, and he went to the doctor. The doctor said, you're eating too much carbohydrate, not enough protein. Put him on a high-protein diet, and his running just returned, and he won 5 Comrades. So he had exactly the same experience. Now, and I think this is the key. We're all individuals. And for individuals, some individuals, a bland carbohydrate diet's fine. It'll provide all the nutrients you need. But for many of us, it doesn't. It's missing in something. Besides the fact that it causes our glucose and insulin to rise too rapidly, there may be other factors that are missing. There may be other nutrients that we don't get out of that diet because we need more nutrients perhaps than others need. And I think that's where we're going to. It's an individual thing. And the reality is everyone has to answer the question for themselves. You have to find out what's the best nutrition for yourself.
How do you do that?
I think first you have to decide you've got a problem. So if your performance is going down and you're putting on weight and you're feeling lousy and you're perpetually hungry, I think those are signs that things are not right. And if that's the condition and you've got a high carbohydrate intake, well then start cutting the carbohydrates. And get rid of the lipophobia. That's the real key. Just don't fear fats. Start eating fats and see what happens. And if you get the response that I did, or Oscar Chalupsky got, or Bruce Fordyce got, then that tells you, this is not the diet for you. The new diet is the one that you want. And then you've got to keep experimenting. And the beauty of this new diet is that you can actually tell from food to food whether you actually like it or not, or whether you need it. I think that your body now tells you what to search for. And there are relatively few foodstuffs that we need on this diet. And your brain will direct you when you need more of one particular foodstuff, you go and eat it. So you've got to trust what your brain's telling you. And I think the beauty of being an athlete like ourselves is that you can actually test your performance. So I test every run I do, I check my performance. And so if my performance starts to go down, I would think that there's something wrong with my nutrition, and I would look to it. And conversely, if I found something that's helpful, I will eat more of that. And I definitely think that the more fish I eat, the better I perform. So again, I think that's the omega-3s. I probably am very dependent on omega-3s to be healthy.
And people who go jogging to lose weight, are they mad?
Yeah. All the exercise in the world will not cause you to lose weight. It has no effect on weight. All it does is makes you hungry, and you continue to eat the foodstuffs that you're always eating. The only way to lose weight is to change your diet. If you're like me and you're carbohydrate intolerant and eat high-fat diets, then your weight comes right down, and then you exercise, and the exercise under those circumstances doesn't drive appetite for reasons that I don't fully understand. The point is that we don't exercise, the point is that we're not lean because we exercise. We exercise because we're lean. You've got to get lean first. And then the brain in some way feels that you're able to do exercise. If you're fat, the brain is starving and it says you can't exercise, you have to rest. And so there's a lot of noise coming from there. Are you catching it?
So anything refined would raise a red flag, in your opinion? Absolutely.
There's no room for eating refined foods because they're just designed for shelf life and to make you addicted and to make you fat.
And cereals with all their fortifications and whatnot, clearly a lot of them are sugar laden, but I believe they're junk. Am I right?
Breakfast to me is the crucial food of the day. And that's when you want to hit it with lots of fat and lots of protein. And that means no cereals and no porridge. So if you're carbohydrate intolerant like myself, or perhaps you've got a weight problem, starting the day with cereals is just the worst thing you can possibly do because it simply kicks up your glucose. It's like a glucose tolerance test. That's all it is. It fires your insulin, it fires your glucose, it fires the addiction, and 3 hours later you're hungry again. Whereas eating 2 eggs and other sources of protein and fat will still your hunger for most of the day and see you right through till the afternoon. And that's what we need to be getting people to do. And the reality is that eggs are one of the 3 most important foodstuffs, one of the 3 healthiest foodstuffs, and they're cheap. And so we went from eating these really good sources of protein and fat to this rubbish cereals, which has got no nutrient value whatsoever. And of course it has to be fortified and it has to be put sugar in because otherwise it tastes like the cardboard it looks like. So when people ask me what do I eat for breakfast, I say I go to the fridge and I get real foods. I don't go and buy the stuff off the shelf where it's dead and decrepit and dying, and you don't want to eat that cardboard. Up to 1959, everyone knew that carbohydrates made you fat, and people were quite happy to eat lots of fat and lots of protein. And the high carbohydrate diet came in, obviously, as a result of Ansel Keys and the lipophobia that he generated. The fear that fat was the cause of heart disease. So he manipulated the data, which has now been well described, and chose 6 countries where there was a linear relationship between increasing fat in a diet and the increasing rate of heart disease. And unfortunately, he deleted 16 countries, and if you add those 16 countries, there is no relationship. And in fact, now, if you look at European countries alone, you'll find there's an inverse relationship between saturated fat intake and heart attack rates. So countries like Switzerland and France, which have the highest fat intakes, have the lowest incidence of heart disease. When other countries I can't remember those countries. What are those countries, the Balkan countries? Is that, would you call them the
Balkans, States?
Yeah, okay, so. Whereas if you look at the Balkan countries with a lower saturated fat intake and very high heart disease rates, so clearly it's not the fat in the diet that's causing the problem, it's something else. And in my view, it would be the processed refined foods. And that the wealthier countries probably eat more saturated fat and more protein and less of the refined foods. So the lipophobia took off, and it's going to take a long time to change that because all medical schools raise their students on that, all dietitians believe it. However, fortunately, there are now 2 major publications last year in which they both said that there's no evidence that saturated fat intake is related to heart disease, or conversely, if you reduce your saturated fat intake, you will reduce your risk of heart attack. So I think that now the science is clear that there is absolutely no evidence that saturated fat is the primary or even an important cause of ill health. And in fact, in the last week, the Nordic countries have drawn up their most recent guidelines, and they completely avoid saying how much fat and how much carbohydrate you should eat, and they don't address the issue of saturated fat. So we now know that the fats that are really dangerous are the ones we were told to eat, the polyunsaturated oils, the omega-6 oils, like sunflower oil and soya oil. and the trans fatty acids which were put into margarine in the first time in 1913, and which we're all told to eat because the margarine companies control also many of the sporting events and advertise their product as healthy. And the trans fatty acids, those are the ones that we have to avoid. So we need to cut the trans fatty acids, the omega-6 oils, and increase omega-3s, which come mainly in fish oils, but which also can be bought as a supplement. I also see no reason to reduce the intake of saturated fats, and in fact, for example, full cream milk is much more healthy for you than skim milk because it contains the vitamins which can be absorbed when they're present with the fat. And there's a whole realization that many of the nutrients in our diet can't be digested unless we have fat present in the diet at the same time. So a diet that is lacking in fat is also lacking in nutrients because we simply don't absorb them properly. So my approach to obesity is that you first make the people lean by putting them on a high-fat diet and without hunger so that they lose the weight. And then they'll become more and more athletic and more keen to exercise. And I certainly found that with my own experience when I changed to the high-fat diet. Now I feel every day I want to go out and exercise, whereas I didn't have that, never had that on the carbohydrate diet. In fact, it was the opposite. So it seems to me that as the fat cells get fatter and fatter and fatter, because we're storing our carbohydrate in the fat cells rather than burning off as fuel, in some way that tells the brain that you've got no fuel because it's all locked away in the fat cells. And as soon as you cut the carbohydrates and cut your insulin secretion, then the fat is released from the fat cells. And as a consequence, your brain says, my goodness, you've got so much energy, let's go out and exercise. And that is quite different. So now when I go out and exercise or run a race, for example, I don't have to eat for the next 6 or 8 hours because my brain's not saying, gee, you've run half a marathon, you now need more food. It just says, no, you're fine. You've got all this fuel. We've just used some of it. And when it's time to eat, well, you'll eat again.
And in terms...
just intercede for a second?
Yeah.
That's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah,
so
it is.
basically,
yeah.
Fat people are starving,
Yeah.
and you eat fat to get thin.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the whole point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fat makes you thin. Yeah, I mean, I can say that. Yeah. So part of the lipophobia problem is that we believe that fat makes us fat, and it's the exact opposite. The more fat you eat, the thinner you become. So I eat about 60% fat now. But I've seen people who eat up to 90% fat, and they're the thinnest people you'll ever see. The bodybuilders are notorious for eating 90% fat. And they say they'd make it 100%, but they have to have some vegetables on which to put the olive oil. So people have to understand that the more fat you eat, the thinner you become. And the other, that's the one problem. The other problem is diabetics are told that if you don't eat lots of carbohydrates, your brain's going to die. And they're absolutely petrified of not eating carbohydrates. And so that's the converse, which is just as bad. And for a diabetic to come off a high carbohydrate diet is very difficult emotionally for them to do it because they've been so ingrained by the medical profession. And the moment they come off the carbohydrates, they reduce the insulin requirements and their health improves as a consequence.
In 2012, I went for a breast MRI. And something lit up like a Christmas light. I had invasive with HER2 amplification, which is very aggressive and metastatic type of breast cancer. I'm going to add the coconut butter. Cancer cells have an Achilles heel. You inhale oxygen, your bloodstream carries oxygen throughout your body, so that's an energy source for healthy cells. And that energy is used by the mitochondria, which is in the cytoplasm of the cell. But cancer cells can't do that.
Don't do this if you have granite.
They can't get energy from oxygen. Cancer cells need to ferment. They need sugar and refined carbohydrate to proliferate. Do you ever see Star Trek, The Trouble with Tribbles? Okay? Do you remember at the end they say, I figured it out. If you don't want them to reproduce, stop feeding them. And that's what cancer is. So I started a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet is a high-fat, very low-carb. It's like Atkins on steroids. This particular diet for cancer means 80% healthy fats, 10, 12, maybe 14% protein, and no more than 12 grams carbohydrates.
Oh yeah, look at how nicely it rose.
All I was looking for was to prevent it from metastasizing. And surprise of surprise, it started shrinking. My tumor started shrinking.
You can see it came out gorgeous.
And my last MRI, the radiologist said, had I not known you were diagnosed and treated, I would look at this from another patient and say, nothing to see here.
So you never actually went through chemotherapy?
I didn't do surgery, I didn't do chemotherapy, and I didn't do radiation, no.
The headscarf is a religious...
Right,
it's not a
yes,
chemotherapy.
absolutely. No, I have my hair.
I don't know how to ask that.
I have my hair.
What did I do that was different from what anybody else can do? And the answer to that was the research. A scientific study changes the picture.
Cancer is described as an immensely heterogeneous disease. That's in fact a buzzword that's now very much in the literature. If you have a primary tumor, this cell can have this mutation, and right next to it you can have a cell that has different mutations, and the cells in the metastases have still different ones. And so what happens is, no matter how you target your cancer therapies, you're going to end up catching some of the mutations, and then some of them are simply going to be mutations you didn't hit with these particular therapies, and then those cells are going to be the ones that survive and come back to get you. Most cancers are treated by cocktails of multiple drugs which fail. They also subject the patient to toxic side effects and poor quality of life while it's failing. But in some respects, the more heterogeneous the cancer gets, the more it tends to converge to a common metabolism. That cancer cells depend on glucose as a source of fuel. That then could lend itself to a metabolic approach which targets just that. I don't know that that's going to be the case in most cancers, but it still doesn't stop me from being optimistic about the idea of using diet as an adjunct to chemotherapies and other forms of therapies to improve the overall efficacy of treatment.
I think a lot of diseases are really the same disease. So like obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, it's all basically the same problem.
Type 2 diabetes is a dietary disease. It's the leading cause of blindness. It's the leading cause of amputations. It's the leading cause of kidney disease and dialysis. It's a leading contributor to cancer. It's a leading contributor to heart disease. So practically 70% of what we practice in modern Western medicine is all related back to your diet.
What happens when you're eating these high-carb diets is, of course, is this constant flood of first sugar and then insulin, because your body's like freaking out. Oh, it's too high. We're going to hit a coma point here. We've got to do something about this. So out comes the insulin.
Maize has become our staple food. It's called pap in South Africa. It's mostly prevalent in impoverished rural communities. In South Africa, that's mostly our black population.
So when we talk about maize being the staple food in Southern Africa, we have to understand how it got there. It was a decision by the South African government to produce maize on an industrial scale. And the question is, well, was that good for our people or not?
It's not indigenous. It was never indigenous to South Africa. All our maize is genetically modified. It's refined. It's high carb. You might as well be eating a bowl full of sugar. And dietitians, including the one who laid the complaint in the first place, are proponents.
And I'll argue that it was the introduction of maize and making this a staple food which has been a problem for us. I've repeatedly been told that there's no evidence to support the low carbohydrate diet. That's incorrect. This is a randomized controlled trial published in 2008 by Dr. Finney. These are expensive trials and there's no money to do it. He does not get funding from the National Institute of Health. He has to go and raise his money himself. This is the evidence. He's putting people with a metabolic syndrome, half of them on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, and the other group on a high fat ketogenic diet. Look at the results. Body mass and abdominal fat, high fat outperforms high carbohydrate, low fat diet. Triglycerides, one of the key markers of metabolic syndrome, down 50% on the high fat diet. What we're not told is when you eat a high carbohydrate diet, your good cholesterol comes down. and you go on a high-fat diet, HDL cholesterol goes up. Very particles that are damaging our arteries are increased on a high-carbohydrate diet and reduced on a high-fat diet. Now, this is even more remarkable. Saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream, which greater your risk of heart attack. Now you eat more saturated fat, and the saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream go down. And millions of rands training hypertension experts, obesity experts, diabetes experts, heart disease experts, but they're all treating the same condition. We can continue to teach a failed model. We can continue to train more doctors and build more hospitals and tell people they must eat lots of carbohydrates. A model that is causing millions of South Africans every few years to develop type 2 diabetes. Or we can say maybe we got it wrong. Because the only people who are suffering besides myself and my wife are the people of South Africa.
Diabetes is something that I see people not much older than myself being diagnosed back home in Ireland. It's something that there seems to be a lazy acceptance of it, and it's something that can be managed and it's not that bad, but it's a devastating disease.
One of the questions that biologists always ask is, if something is common, it must be there for an evolutionary reason. It must have been beneficial. So if we think that carbohydrate intolerance is very common amongst particularly Europeans, there must have been a reason for it. And the answer is that when we were eating a high-fat, high-protein diet, it was very beneficial to be carbohydrate resistant, because any carbohydrate you took in, you'd immediately turn to fat. But other times, you would be able to burn fat and protein and not carbohydrate for fuel. So it was absolutely ideal. And that's why I believe that many Europeans are carbohydrate intolerant. It's because biologically it was very advantageous when they lived in a cold environment when they were eating fat animals. If you come from Africa, the animals are much leaner, and it was always difficult to get fatty animals. And the traditional hunters, like the Bushmen, they thrived on fat. They loved fat, and part of their theory or part of their religion is that when they die and go to heaven, the first thing they're given is a gourd of fat. So they live believing that that's what they're going to get given. So humans, in my view, are driven to find fat. And that's when you are fat tolerant and carbohydrate intolerant, eating lots of fat is ideal. Our problem was we took these people who were carbohydrate intolerant and gave them high carbohydrate diets. And it becomes apparent in your 40s and 50s. And at that time, if you're carbohydrate intolerant, the only treatment you need is just to go back to the native state. Just go and continue to eat your high-fat, high-protein diet, and you won't get sick. But if you continue to eat the high-carbohydrate diet, you're in real trouble. So it's really simple. You know, we're designed to burn fat and carbohydrate. So the answer is it's really simple. We're designed to burn fat and protein, and we're carbohydrate intolerant. And it's very healthy to be that way. It's just not healthy when you're in an environment where there's so much carbohydrate.
There's a misunderstanding that if you're eating a high-fat diet, you're not getting carbohydrate and the glucose and the energy that you need. And that seems to be one of the first flags that people raise.
Because humans are adapted for starvation, we have this incredible capacity to turn on glucose production. And we can easily produce all the glucose we need for our brains from the fat and the protein in the diet. And it takes a day or two to adapt. The irony is that in pre-diabetes, the major problem is not only that you can't take the glucose into the muscles and burn it, it's also that the liver is overproducing glucose. So the treatment for pre-diabetes is to get the liver to stop producing glucose. And the simple way is to reduce your carbohydrate intake. So pre-diabetes, so people with pre-diabetes are overproducing glucose already. They're producing too much. And then the scientists tell us, no, you've got a problem with glucose production. It's not true. We're overproducing glucose. And the instant you reduce your carbohydrate intake, you normalize liver glucose production in diabetes, and then has major consequences for your metabolism.
So why would the diabetes organizations around the world be recommending carbohydrates?
The diabetes associations around the world are controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry is petrified that if we found a way to reduce insulin requirements in diabetics, their business would disappear. I receive each day a letter from a diabetic telling me that as a consequence of changing to this diet that I propose, they've reduced the insulin requirements, and usually it's dramatic. Many people can cut the insulin requirements right down to almost nothing. And the consequences for the industry are enormous because insulin is very expensive. Only last week I was chatting to an insulin-dependent diabetic who for 8 years she'd been able to reduce her insulin requirements by half, and it was saving her £100 a month. Now that doesn't sound much, but if you multiply £100 by 3 million diabetics, then you get a scale of the problem. And my view is that most of the people who are on diabetic medication are being over-medicated. And the instant you cut their carbohydrate intake, they're going to require less of the oral antidiabetics or else of insulin. And the consequence for the industry would be catastrophic. Someone has estimated that 6 companies would go under if we were to get all carbohydrates to eat high-fat, high-protein diets.
And the savings to governments would be enormous as well, clearly.
Governments would save enormously if they were able to do this. And time will come when they realize that they don't have to pay that much. So maybe governments will be where the change will come from. But it's not going to come from the medical profession itself, because they're too ingrained and too infiltrated by industry and too controlled by industry. So if we could get all diabetics to eat a high-fat, high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet, we would cut their insulin requirements so dramatically that it's been estimated that 6 pharmaceutical companies would go out of business tomorrow. So that's the problem, and the industry won't lie down and let that happen. They will make sure that all doctors believe that a high-carbohydrate diet is the only treatment for diabetes.
And these are multi-billion-dollar companies.
These are all multi-billion-dollar companies making billions of dollars from ill health. And the point again is that preventing disease is not on their agenda, because the moment you prevent disease, you cut down into their profits. The reality is it's very easy to stay healthy with a little bit of information. And that little bit of information is that you must be physically active and you must eat the diet that's appropriate for you. And unfortunately, the prudent diet has proven to be a complete disaster. In my view, far from preventing heart disease, the prudent diet, which is based on the food pyramid, which was promoted by the US Department of Agriculture from 1977, that pyramid is the reverse of what it should be. And that is driving obesity and diabetes and heart disease and probably many other diseases. And until we can reverse that and make people understand that fat and protein are very healthy and probably much more healthy than carbohydrates for most of us, we're really not going to make any difference to the obesity and diabetes and heart disease problems that we have. And the answer is that once you have made the change like I have, you see it so clearly. Last week I was in London and I just noticed that people are enormous and they're all eating this rubbish carbohydrates, and everywhere you go there's just these refined, highly delicious, not nutritious, highly desirable foods everywhere you go. How can you change it? It's going to take a major shift.